July 24, 1943. 2:43 a.m., Hamburg, Germany. On the third floor of a tenement near the Speicherstadt, Marta Klein pressed the heel of her hand to the window and felt it hum with a distant, metallic heartbeat. The glass shook in its frame like a thin drum skin. Outside, a pale, wrong sun, the glare of fires already burning in the docks, fought through a sky scored by contrails. Far above, at altitudes that turned breath to ice and thoughts to fog, the silhouette of a B-17 cut the stars like a leviathan, for radial engines thrumming in tight, mechanical chorus. Marta could not tell one fuselage from another. From the street they were a single, endless river of brightness, a line that crawled west to east and back again, night after night. At 27,000 feet, Captain Thomas Mallory watched the world through fogged plexiglass and frost-rimed instruments. The nose of his flying fortress, a B-17G with a battered chin turret and patched paint, held a pilot's steady impatience. Mallory, 32, felt the small, private rituals of a man who had learned to live on checklists and knocks on the instrument panel, a thumbs up to the engineer, a silent prayer to the bombardier, a quick squeeze to the co-pilot's shoulder. His breath fogged his goggles. Through the slipstream and cloud they had little time to look at each other. There was only the task: keep formation, keep altitude, keep faith that the heavy bird beneath them would hold together long enough to find the city, drop a pattern of metal that might break an enemy's will. Bombardier reports, target acquired, came the clipped voice over the interphone, First Lieutenant Harold Pierce, young hands white on the Norden. The green glow of his instrument was a small, stubborn island in the cockpit's darkness. Mallory tasted coffee on his tongue, the cheap powdered stuff that had become a kind of sacrament aboard long missions. Around them the crew moved in the narrow ballet of a well-drilled machine, waist gunners checking feed belts, the tail gunner adjusting his harness, the top turret spinning to scan the horizon. Outside, more fortresses marched in columns, their formation like a skeleton key opening the sky. Below, on a cobbled street in a district already half-ash, old man Becker shepherded his neighbor's child, little Gretel, into an underground shelter. The sirens had howled for hours and still the air was punctured by concussive thumps, not all of them explosions, some were the heavy, distant booms of aircraft engines. The shelter smelled of iron, of wet wool, of the particular, patient odor of people conserving heat. Flashlight beams cut the dark like small comets. Men spoke in low, hoarse voices that left the edges of their sentences hanging, rumor, speculation, rote recitation of civil defense orders. They come every day, someone said. They come at dawn, at dusk. They keep coming. The phrase had become a kind of prayer and an accusation in the same breath. On the ground, the first human responses were practical: shovels, buckets, the stacking of sandbags over basement windows. But there was also a stooped astonishment in the eyes of those who had watched the sky for months. How, they asked each other, could machines be replaced so quickly? How could these black crosses of metal and smoke be answered by a flood of white-limbed birds at dawn? Soldiers in gray-smudged uniforms, Feldwebel Hans Richter among them, had their own quiet amazement. He had fought with the Luftwaffe. He had seen fighters climb and dive and claimed victories. Yet even he, standing with a collar-cuffed cigarette and a tin mug of ersatz coffee, felt the old narrative shifting. Air supremacy could be a question of production as much as skill, and the unseen factories across the ocean were beginning to speak in numbers. Back in the sky, formation flying was a kind of trust fall. The B-17s kept a precise distance, a few dozen feet laterally, a small fraction of that fore and aft. Too close invited collision, a mistake that could turn metal into a funeral pyre, too far and the tight defensive circles of machine gun fire that made the fortress a flying fortress would not knit together. Around Mallory's ship, the wastes and the bell turret spat an ongoing conversation of tracer against nothing, halos of yellow that tried to find a friend or foe in a night sky punctured by searchlights that moved like mechanical fingers. The Luftwaffe's night defenses were not yet the web they would become. Flak batteries below fired up in hesitant bouquets, orange blooms that painted the cloud undersides with light. Each burst was a thunderclap, a breath-stealing event that could peel metal, tear fabric, or simply explode into a smear of shrapnel that never quite found its mark. Flak at 6 o'clock, 2,500 feet below, the radio crackled. Mallory saw one burst too close for comfort, a bloom of incandescent petals that took the tail assembly grazing. It was a whisper of damage that, if left unchecked, could become a deadly conversation. In the houses of Hamburg, and in other cities to the north and south, a different kind of tally was being kept. Not of tonnage or bomb patterns, but of the small, human metrics that counted for survival, which friend had a safe cellar, which shopkeeper might spare a loaf, whether the night watch would find enough straw for the cows. In the municipal registry office, Frau Helene Bauer, an archivist, packed a satchel with records, deeds and birth certificates, items the local magistrate ordered saved if possible. If it comes to this, she told herself, if the city is leveled, we must at least keep our names. The act was both practical and symbolic. Names, she believed, were the last things the state could not erase without a fight. The American crews, men like Mallory, like Lieutenant Robert Jensen at his side, the navigator, a man with a map pouch yellowed with use, held to their task in a way that was almost religious. The bomber doctrine that had sent them over Europe in ever-growing waves hinged on industrial arithmetic as much as courage. Planes could be built faster than they were lost. Replace one fortress lost over Essen with two fresh from plant and depot, spin parts from Dayton and Wichita, turn rookies into veterans with tours that hardened muscles and nerves. The operational tempo was relentless. Briefings descended like miniature sermons, routes, choke points, expected fighter opposition, cloud decks, the weather's betrayals. They spoke in numbers, altitude, pounds of explosives, knots of airspeed, and in names, a target, a magnet, a single address on a map that meant whole neighborhoods. The German city below registered these numbers as weather. "There will be a raid in the morning," was spoken in the same resigned voice with which a person might say, "There will be rain." In the bakeries, the ovens were kept warm longer at night. Wartime resourcefulness took on the face of survivalist creativity. Curtains were layered and double-paned where possible, families learned to sleep in cellars and to cook by candlelight when blackouts came. Children learned to count the engines, to recognize not the code name of a bomber but the human rhythm of its approach. "For engines," a boy whispered once, as if naming a saint. "They always come in fours." On the flight deck, Mallory's mind ran through another cadence, the weight of the bombs, the run-in, the needle of the Norden that demanded steady hands. Outside the world was made abstract, a map of streets and rail yards that would resolve, at the appointed moment, into destruction and smoke. He glanced down, caught a patch of river shining like a blade. The bombardier's voice came clear as a bell, "Bombs away in 10, 9. The release was a mechanical let-go and a moral one. The fortress shuddered as 20,000 pounds of iron and explosive parted company, falling away into the night to become a grammar of ruin on whatever patch of earth lay beneath. At ground level, the bombs were an arithmetic of things that used to be: bakeries, a tram depot, an apartment block with a bicycle leaning against the stairwell, ordinary objects turned into evidence of ordinary lives. There was, too, the small, personal drama that repeated in millions of private ways. Marta pressed her arms around Gretel and felt the child's body shudder with each blast as if the sound could fold her in two. She thought, not of strategy, but of Mrs. von Albrecht across the hall, an old woman who had sewn uniforms once and who kept, irrationally, a photo album. If the album burns, Marta thought, then perhaps the things she loved will not be remembered. Her mind reached for a pocket of meaning, a name, a face, a recipe. This is the way civilians kept their humanity, by binding memory to objects. On the perimeter of the city, in a temporary Luftwaffe observation post, Feldwebel Richter watched the lights bloom and dim, watching for patterns that would tell him whether the Allies had changed tactics. He made notes on a battered pad, practical marks that could later be stitched into reports. But his eyes kept drifting upward with a fierce, private curiosity. The pilots they sent up, the Me-109s and FW-190s, were brave men doing their job, but their numbers were thinning, their fuel scarce, and the Allies' night and day strategy taxed every seam of Germany's war economy. Hans had been a boy when he first saw an American aircraft. As the months passed, that boyish awe had turned to a rueful respect. "They keep coming," he murmured, and this was not only an observation but an admission. The enemy's capacity to replace losses had become its most frightening weapon. In the dim, shaking world between heaven and earth, between the cockpit's clipped calls and the shelter's whispered litany, an idea circulated like a cold current: this was not simply attrition. It was a measure of modern war in which production lines spoke as loudly as guns. The factories from which those fortresses had flown, the plants in Missouri and Nebraska and California, hummed, beyond immediate reach, as a kind of invisible armament. For every bomber falling into a field, there were two being put together in a wooden shed in Kansas or an aluminum press in Seattle. The consequence was a terror that had less to do with one raid and more with a steady, inexorable assertion that the sky could be filled and refilled like a tide. And still the B-17s kept coming, for engines, a chorus, a machine-like regularity that translated into a growing, unavoidable idea in the German mind. At first it seemed an exaggeration, then a rumor, then an empirical truth: morning, noon, dusk. They came in waves, they came in formations, sometimes they came alone, as if to mock the dead. For those on the receiving end, the question narrowed to the single, human calculus of survival: how long could a city hold its breath? How many more nights before the shelters filled with the weight of what had been lost? Captain Mallory guided his fortress through cloud and flak toward the rendezvous point. He could not see the faces of the people below, he could not know the names of the women and old men huddled under blankets, the sound of a child's whimper. What he could measure was the aircraft under his hands, the fuel in the tanks, the bitter cold that crept through the seams. He had letters sewn into his uniform from a woman named Grace back home, a small, human proof against the abstraction of his task. He folded them once in the dark and kept them close like a talisman. Far below, Marta clutched a photograph of a daughter whose face had been partly singed in an earlier raid, a talisman of another kind. Both hoped for some improbable mercy. When the raid ended and the bombers turned for home, when the night resumed its cold, brittle silence punctuated only by the distant, intermittent groan of collapsing masonry, the city reeled in a way that could not be healed by a single sunrise. People emerged from shelters to count what remained: kitchens, walls, the stubborn, useless skeletons of trees. They checked on neighbors. They repaired what could be mended. They whispered about the endless sea of planes and the men who flew them. The myth began to harden into fact: the Americans had learned a new kind of war, one in which the speed of replacement was a weapon as crucial as any cannon. August 1943, 6,000 miles away. Wichita, Kansas. The rhythmic thud of a rivet gun was the heartbeat of another world. Rows upon rows of B-17 fuselages, gleaming like silver whales under fluorescent light, stretched into a vanishing point. The air was thick with the smell of oil, hot aluminum, and the faint sweetness of cafeteria coffee. Women in overalls, rosies, with bandanas and tired eyes, worked shoulder to shoulder with teenage apprentices and veterans too old for combat. The war in Europe was an ocean away, but every hammer strike here sent ripples across it. A foreman shouted over the din, "We're pushing for 24-hour rotation. The boys need wings." And they did: wings, engines, landing gear, all assembled with mechanical precision and patriotic fervor. In Plant No. 2 alone, a new B-17 rolled off the line every hour and a half. On the wall above the production line hung a simple slogan: "For every fortress lost, two will rise." The men and women believed it, because it was true. By 1943, the United States was outproducing every Axis nation combined. Factories that had once built cars or farm machinery now birthed bombers. Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan, the size of a small city, turned out one B-24 every 63 minutes. Boeing's Seattle facility, along with Douglas and Vega in California, fed a constant stream of bombers to airfields across England. The scale of production seemed inhuman, and in a way, it was. It belonged to a new age, one where machines could replicate war faster than men could understand it. Back in England, the result of this industrial might filled the horizon. RAF Thule, Bedfordshire. Lieutenant Jensen stood on the perimeter track, his breath frosting in the dawn air. The fortresses of the 306th Bomb Group lined up like titans in armor, each with its nickname painted in jaunty defiance: Heavenly Days, Milk Run Maggie, OL, Faithful. Ground crews moved with the quiet efficiency of men who no longer looked up at the bombers, only at their engines and instruments. Another one coming in, a mechanic called, pointing east. Over the trees, the deep, droning hum of 4 Wright Cyclones approached, the sound of survival. A new B-17G, fresh from the States, gleamed silver as it taxied to a stop. A truck from the quartermaster rolled up beside it with paint cans ready for the nose art. The system was that fast, as soon as one bomber went down over Bremen or Kassel, its replacement was already in the air from the Atlantic coast. The crews called it the endless tide. To the German civilians who lived beneath that tide, it became something almost mythological, an unending punishment delivered by invisible hands. The American flyers were ghosts to them, men who never seemed to die, whose machines filled the sky day after day. Hamburg again, August 3, 1943. Marta Klein had begun keeping a small notebook in the weeks since the first firestorm. She wrote down what she saw because speaking had become impossible. "The planes come every morning now," she wrote in neat, looping script. "We pray, then we sweep the ash from the steps. Then we pray again." She'd lost her neighbor Becker 2 days prior. The shelter had collapsed, trapping him beneath the bricks. They'd found him holding a child that wasn't his, Gretel. The girl survived, dazed but alive. Marta took her in, because the city had erased family lines. In the gray daylight that followed each raid, the sky itself looked bruised. When the next wave came, it was broad daylight. Sirens howled. People no longer ran, they walked, almost resigned. Feldwebel Richter was stationed at a flak battery on the outskirts, manning an 88mm gun. He'd seen the formations before, but this was different. The sky was crowded with bombers, so many that his rangefinder could not count them all. "They're endless," one of the gunners murmured. Richter's reply was barely audible: "No, they're American." He'd studied the B-17 silhouette for months, the squared tail, the long wings, the blunt nose. He knew where to aim, how to time the burst. But it didn't matter. For every bomber that fell trailing black smoke, 2 more filled the gap. The pattern was unnerving, almost unnatural. "Fewer free," he ordered, and the gun roared, belching fire and cordite smoke. Flak bursts bloomed black across the heavens. One fortress staggered, losing altitude, and the gun crew cheered. Yet their cheers faded quickly as another formation rolled in behind it, tighter, higher, and perfectly aligned. It was like fighting a machine that could never tire. Back in the skies, Captain Mallory's crew held their formation through turbulence and flak bursts that painted the air with shrapnel. Jensen, hunched over his map, shouted over the engine roar, "They've got the batteries zeroed in on us." Mallory didn't flinch. "Hold steady. If we scatter, we die." Their job wasn't to dodge the flak, it was to fly through it. Every man on that crew knew it. The fortress was designed for punishment, to take hits and keep flying. They called her the Queen of the Skies, and she earned it. Even when holes the size of fists opened in her fuselage, even when a control cable snapped, the B-17 could limp home on 2 engines. Below them, Richter's flak crew reloaded. His ears rang from the blasts, his throat raw from shouting. "Reload. Faster," he barked, but inside he was thinking something he couldn't voice aloud: "If they can replace every plane we shoot down, how do we win?" The Allied strategy wasn't just to destroy, it was to exhaust. To drain Germany of the very ability to resist. Factories, refineries, rail yards, everything that kept the Reich's heart beating was targeted. And with every new dawn, the Germans saw the same sight, the contrails, the sunlight glinting on silver wings, the low, droning thunder that made children cover their ears and men curse the heavens. At first, they believed it would stop. That America couldn't possibly sustain this pace. But then the rumors started, of factories in Kansas working around the clock, of American workers building bombers faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. By the fall of 1943, even German propaganda struggled to explain it. Berlin, Propaganda Ministry. Joseph Goebbels stood in front of a large map dotted with red pins, each one a bombed city. His aides shifted nervously. "We tell the people it's temporary," he said flatly, "but they no longer believe us." He paused, tapping the map with a pencil. "They don't fear defeat," he said. "They fear the sound." The sound, the endless drone of engines that filled every dream, every prayer, every silence between sirens. From Hamburg to Hanover, Frankfurt to Dresden, it was the same. The B-17s kept coming. And across the Atlantic, in a Kansas factory where shift bells never stopped ringing, a teenage girl named Betty wiped sweat from her forehead and whispered to herself, "Somewhere out there, this one's for my brother." She tightened the last bolt on a wing spar and signed her initials in grease pencil. That wing would soon carry another fortress over the skies of Europe. And someone, somewhere in Germany, would look up, and wonder how America's machines never seemed to die. October 9, 1943, Münster, Germany. It was noon when the sirens began, but to most citizens, the sound was no longer a signal to panic, it was simply routine. The people of Münster had lived under the shadow of those long, silver wings for months now. They knew the pattern, the low hum rising in the west, the faint vibration that shook the windowpanes before the sky opened with thunder. In a small bakery on Ludgerstrasse, Marta Klein stood behind the counter, her apron dusted with flour. She had taken work wherever she could find it, baking with what little wheat the ration offices allowed. Gretel sat beneath the counter, drawing on the back of old ration forms. When the sirens began, neither of them moved at first. It was only when the floor began to tremble that Marta whispered, "Come on, sweetheart. Down below." They moved into the basement, where half a dozen others already huddled, faces pale in the lantern light, every breath thick with soot and dust. Someone murmured, "It's them again. The fortresses." Another voice, sharper, said, "Every single day now. Every day." Above them, the first explosions came like punctuation marks, deliberate, evenly spaced. The Allies called it carpet bombing. To the people below, it was something far more primal, an erasure. 27,000 feet above the chaos, Captain Thomas Mallory's gloved hands gripped the control yoke of his B-17 Grim Lady. The aircraft rattled violently in the slipstream. Frost clung to the inside of the glass, the engines roared in rhythmic defiance. "Flak ahead." Heavy, the co-pilot, Lieutenant Jensen, shouted, his voice cracking through the intercom. Mallory could see it, black bursts blooming like malignant flowers across the sky. They weren't random. The Germans had learned. Each burst formed a lethal pattern, a box of explosions designed to trap bombers in their deadly geometry. "Hold course," Mallory barked. "We're almost over the IP." The intercom crackled again. "Bombardier ready." He could feel the fortress shaking, feel the shrapnel pinging off the fuselage like hail. Through the cockpit glass, the earth below seemed alive with fire. The whole city of Münster was laid out in miniature, the cathedral spire, the market square, the narrow river curling through the ruins. And everywhere, black smoke clawing at the daylight. "Bombs away," came the call. The aircraft lurched upward as 5 tons of high explosives fell free. Mallory leaned over, catching a glimpse of the bombs spinning downward, their tails flashing in the sun. He'd stopped trying to imagine what they hit. The sight was too big, too detached. The only thing that mattered was staying alive through the run. On the ground, Richter's flak battery was already firing when the first wave came through. The noise was unbearable, not just the guns, but the sky itself screaming. "Elevate! 80 degrees!" Richter shouted. The gun crew obeyed, sweat pouring down their faces despite the chill. Each 88mm shell exploded at altitude, sending iron fragments into the bomber formations. He saw one fortress catch fire, its wing breaking, spinning downward in slow motion. The men around him cheered, a reflex rather than joy. Then the cheer died. Above them, the formation closed ranks. The gap left by the falling bomber was instantly filled by another. Perfect spacing. Perfect formation. It was as if the machine had healed itself in midair. Richter stared upward, breathless. "How can they keep coming?" he whispered. No one answered. In England, just hours earlier, that same formation had lifted off from Thule airfield before dawn. Crews gathered in the freezing dark, clutching mugs of wheat coffee, listening to the mission briefing. Primary target, Munster. Objective, rail junction and industrial yard. Expect heavy resistance. The intelligence officer pointed at the map. "You are part of the second wave. The first will soften the flak zones. Remember, steady formation, steady nerves." They'd been on so many missions now that the words hardly registered. The rookies sat silent, faces pale under the dim lamps. Veterans like Mallory knew better than to comfort them. Every man learned the truth in his own time. The fortress was strong, but not invincible. When the engines started, the airfield shook. Dozens of bombers rolled down the runway, their four engines screaming in synchronized power. The ground crew stood back, waving them off, each man wondering which of the birds would return that night. Hours later, after the bomb run, the grim lady turned west for home. Smoke curled from the left outboard engine, not enough to bring them down, but enough to make the long flight back to England a gamble. Jensen looked at the fuel gauges. "We'll make it, maybe." Mallory gave a grim smile. "Then we'll make it." The radio operator patched into the formation frequency. The chatter was thin, exhausted. Reports of casualties, of planes trailing smoke, of engines gone silent. Yet the formation stayed intact. Discipline and design held it together, a flying machine of men and steel. Below, the city of Munster burned. And in the shelters, people prayed not for victory anymore, but for silence. As night fell, the surviving fortresses touched down one by one on the fog-shrouded runways of eastern England. Ground crews rushed out with fire extinguishers and stretchers. Holes the size of fists marked the fuselages, glass was shattered, wings scorched. Yet they had returned, battered but whole. Mallory climbed down from the cockpit, exhausted, face black with soot. Jensen followed, limping slightly. They said little. Their ritual was always the same, a pat on the nose of the plane, a nod to the crew, a silent thanks. Inside the operations hut, the mission board clerk began marking the tally. Munster, objective complete. 12 aircraft lost. He hesitated, then added under his breath, 73 made it back. Behind him, a chalkboard listed replacement aircraft already en route from the States. Numbers filled the spaces where names had once been. To the machine of war, they were interchangeable. To the men who flew them, they were ghosts with new serial numbers. By late 1943, the Germans had begun to realize a truth they couldn't speak aloud: their cities were not just targets, they were messages. Each raid was proof that America's factories could reach them without pause, without mercy. Even the Luftwaffe's best aces began to feel the change. Fuel shortages, spare parts delays, and constant attrition turned the once mighty defense of the Reich into a desperate struggle. Richter saw it in his comrades' faces, the fatigue, the disbelief. They still manned their guns. They still fought. But deep down, they understood something that no propaganda could erase: this war was being decided not in the skies, but in the factories oceans away. And each new dawn brought the same sound, the endless hum of engines across the horizon. The B-17s were coming again. Every single day. January 1944, Schweinfurt, Germany. A grey morning crept over the ruins of the once proud industrial city. Chimneys that had survived the last raid stood crooked like broken fingers against the sky. The air smelled of brick dust and oil. Snow had fallen during the night, but by dawn it was blackened with soot. Children scraped frost from cellar doors, collecting bits of unburned coal from the rubble. They no longer looked up when engines echoed overhead, there was no point. At 10:17 a.m., the sirens began again. The fourth alarm that week. In a narrow alley near the ball-bearing plant, a woman paused mid-step, looked to the horizon, and muttered what every German now said with equal parts awe and despair. "They're back." At 25,000 feet above, Captain Thomas Mallory leaned forward in his seat, eyes squinting through the perspex canopy. The air was thin and brittle, freezing every exposed edge of the cockpit. The grim lady droned in formation, one silver bird among hundreds, a vast, glimmering swarm stretching from one horizon to the other. "Navigator, report." Lieutenant Jensen bent over his map, the pencil shaking in his gloved hand. "Course confirmed. IP in 3 minutes." Below, the clouds broke apart like torn fabric, revealing the black scars of Schweinfurt's factories. Smoke already rose from the city, the second wave had found its mark. Now it was their turn. Mallory adjusted his oxygen mask and steadied the yoke. The interphone crackled to life. "Bomb bay doors open." The cold rushed in, the smell of oil and metal filling the cockpit. He glanced out the side window and saw another fortress to port, OL, faithful, its fuselage peppered with flak holes, one engine feathered, but still flying steady. The pilot, Major Henry Ross, gave a quick salute. Mallory returned it. Then the flak started. The sky bloomed with black puffs, angry bursts that rocked the formation. One explosion slammed against the grim lady's left wing, rattling the entire frame. Shrapnel clanged off the fuselage like hailstones. "Number 3 engines hit," the engineer shouted. Mallory's voice came back calm, clipped. "Feather it. Keep her steady." Through the glass nose, the bombardier called out the run. "Target in sight, steady, bombs away." The plane jolted upward as 5,000 pounds of explosives dropped free, vanishing into the gray void below. A heartbeat later, the bombardier's voice cracked with disbelief. "Direct hit. Bearing factories gone." Mallory didn't answer. He was already pulling into a climb, trying to escape the storm of flak. Behind them, another B-17 took a hit square to the wing root. The entire left side of the aircraft erupted in flame. It spiraled downward, shedding fragments of metal that glittered in the sunlight. No parachutes appeared. The crew of the grim lady watched in silence, and then, without a word, tightened formation. That was the rule, keep flying. On the ground, Feldwebel Hans Richter and his gun crew were choking in the smoke of their own guns. The factory district was a sea of fire. Flames leapt from one roof to another, and the concussion of bombs had shattered every window within half a mile. "Reload," he screamed over the din. The loader slammed another shell into the breach. They fired again, blind now, aiming only at sound and instinct. Above them, the bombers were just black dots, moving in mechanical precision. And for every one they hit, more followed, perfectly spaced, perfectly timed. One of his men, barely 20, turned and shouted, "Herr Feldwebel. When will it stop?" Richter didn't answer. He didn't know anymore. He'd seen too many raids, too many bombers. He remembered when the sky had been the domain of German pilots, the proud eagles of the Luftwaffe. Now it belonged to something else, a relentless, tireless machine that had learned to make war with mathematics. He looked up and muttered, "This is what it means to fight a country that never runs out." By the end of that day, Schweinfurt's industrial heart was gone. The bearing factories, vital to the Wehrmacht's tanks and aircraft, lay in ruins. The bombers returned home, battered but mostly intact. At Thule, England, the debriefing room was thick with fatigue. Cigarette smoke curled toward the ceiling. The crews spoke in hoarse murmurs, their voices stripped of emotion. 79 fortresses down, the intelligence officer said quietly. But the target's gone. Command says it was worth it. Mallory looked at the photograph on the briefing board, a reconnaissance shot of Schweinfurt, now a gray smear of craters. He thought of the flak bursts, of the falling bomber, of the men who hadn't made it back. Worth it, he repeated under his breath, but it sounded less like conviction and more like resignation. Meanwhile, in Germany, the myth of the invincible fortress took on a new dimension. Civilians began calling them Himmelsfestungen, fortresses of heaven. To many, the name wasn't sarcasm. There was something godlike in the way the bombers came, untouchable, unending, unfeeling. Marta Klein had moved again, this time to Kassel, where she worked in a munitions office by day and slept in a shared cellar by night. Each week, the raids crept closer. Each week, she wrote fewer words in her notebook. The last entry she made before the bombing of Kassel read simply, "They say the Americans can build more planes than we have bullets." When the next raid came, she didn't run. She just waited, hands folded, eyes closed, while the sky above her city split open. In London, journalists covering the Allied air campaign wrote of the industrial miracle. American and British newspapers published photos of bombers in tight formation, praising the bravery of the crews and the precision of the raids. But on the ground, on both sides, the human cost grew unbearable. Thousands of civilians died in those raids. Entire neighborhoods vanished beneath the hammer of progress. Still, the production lines in America did not stop. The factories worked day and night, an empire of smoke and noise stretching from Seattle to St. Louis. Every rivet, every seam, every engine was a promise that the next wave would fly. And so it did. By early 1944, the Germans had stopped asking if the bombers would come. They asked only when. Morning? Noon? Night? It no longer mattered. The fortresses owned the sky. And every sunrise brought the same impossible truth, the sound of 1,000 engines rolling east across the English Channel. The B-17s were coming again. Because they always came. April 1944, Berlin, Germany. The capital of the Reich stood defiant, but tired. Entire blocks lay gutted, their skeletons outlined in moonlight. The Brandenburg Gate was draped in banners still proclaiming Sieg Heil, but the words had begun to sound like echoes from another age. The city that once roared with parades now whispered in the dark. In an underground bunker near Tempelhof Airfield, General der Flieger Walter Keller traced a trembling finger over a map pocked with red circles: Hamburg, Cologne, Schweinfurt, Kassel, and now Berlin. Each red mark was a wound, a scar left by the Allied bombing campaign. "How long can we defend the skies?" asked an aide quietly. Keller didn't look up. His eyes were hollow. "Until there's nothing left to defend." Outside, the night hummed with distant engines, faint, rhythmic, relentless. The city's anti-aircraft guns began to bark, their flashes lighting up the clouds. Then came the sirens. The people of Berlin moved underground once again. Inside one of the shelters beneath Alexanderplatz, dozens huddled shoulder to shoulder. The air was thick and sour, heavy with damp coats and fear. Candles flickered on crates that served as tables. Mothers clutched children who no longer cried, they just stared at the trembling ceiling. An elderly man whispered, "How many this time?" A young soldier, barely out of training, replied, "They say 1,000. 1,000 planes?" He nodded. "And they're not alone. The British will follow." The room went silent. Then, far above, the first wave of bombs began to fall. The earth shook. Dust rained from the ceiling. Somewhere nearby, glass shattered like a scream. A woman began to pray softly in Latin, words from another war, another generation. At 25,000 feet above the chaos, Captain Mallory's grim lady once again led her formation. Frost edged the windows. His hands, numb in their gloves, trembled just slightly on the controls. They were approaching Berlin, the most heavily defended target in all of Europe. Below them, a living storm of flak erupted. Black bursts blossomed so thick that it seemed impossible to fly through them. "Navigator," Mallory shouted over the interphone, "confirm heading." "Steady as she goes, skipper. We're on the mark." The plane jolted violently as a shell burst nearby, punching holes through the fuselage. "Number 2's losing pressure," the engineer called out. Mallory gritted his teeth. "Hold her together. We're not turning back." Through the nose glass, Berlin unfolded below, rivers of fire and smoke winding through the city's heart. The bombardier adjusted his sight, sweat freezing on his forehead. Target in view, steady, bombs away. The grim lady leapt as the payload dropped. Seconds later, the shockwave from explosions below buffeted them hard. "Direct hit," came the report. Mallory didn't reply. He could see the fires spreading, not just across the factories or the rail yards, but through entire districts. He knew what that meant. Civilians. Families. People like the ones in those cellars. He looked away. "Let's go home." On the ground, Berlin was no longer a city, it was an inferno. Streets boiled with heat. The air itself seemed to burn. In the shelter near Alexanderplatz, the candlelight went out as the shockwave tore through the tunnels. The young soldier who'd spoken earlier now lay face down on the concrete, blood pooling near his helmet. The woman beside him still whispered prayers, her voice hoarse but steady, "Deliver us from evil." Outside, the anti-aircraft guns fired until their barrels glowed red. Then one by one, they fell silent. When dawn came, the smoke still covered the city like a shroud. Back in England, the bombers landed in silence. The crews stepped down, blackened faces, hollow eyes, trembling hands. No one spoke. They knew they had struck deep. They also knew what they had done. A chaplain walked among them, offering quiet words. Some men refused to meet his eyes. Others simply stared at the horizon, watching the sun rise over the airfield. Mallory lit a cigarette, hands shaking. "Berlin," he whispered, "isn't just a target. It's a graveyard." His co-pilot said nothing. There was nothing left to say. In Germany, the myth of the Luftwaffe's supremacy was over. The once proud fighter wings had been reduced to skeleton squadrons. Young boys now sat in cockpits once flown by veterans. Their instructors told them they would defend the fatherland. Most never returned from their first sortie. But the bombers kept coming. Day after day. Night after night. To the German people, it began to feel like the sky itself had turned against them. And yet, amidst the ruins, something else stirred, quiet resentment, whispered in basements and bread lines. For the first time, many began to question the men who had promised victory. The spell was breaking. The Reich was cracking from within. And in the east, the Red Army was moving closer. By summer, the Americans had begun targeting oil refineries, railway hubs, and the few remaining factories that kept the German war machine alive. The precision grew sharper. The raids more frequent. The skies, darker. The grim lady flew her 24th mission that July. Few B-17s ever made it that far. When she returned, she was riddled with holes, half her instruments dead, one engine smoking. But she landed. Mallory stepped out and placed a hand on her fuselage, scarred, burned, but still standing. He whispered, "You've done enough, old girl. That night, he wrote in his logbook. Berlin burns. But so does something in me. Yet even as Germany's cities turned to ash, one truth remained unspoken among the crews: the closer they came to victory, the harder it became to believe in it. Because every success felt like loss. Every mission, a funeral in disguise. And though the war was far from over, the men who flew the fortresses had begun to wonder, what would be left of the world they were fighting to save? February 1945, Altenburg, Germany. The once proud railway junction lay in ruin. Trains that once carried coal and soldiers now sat motionless, their carriages twisted and burned. Children scavenged among the wreckage for anything useful: bits of metal, torn fabric, even charred bread. The war that had promised glory had instead delivered starvation. From the gray sky above came a deep, familiar thunder. Every head turned upward. Some pointed. Others simply closed their eyes. A woman whispered to her son, "It's them again, the fortresses." The child didn't ask which ones. Everyone knew. 20,000 feet above, Captain Mallory's grim lady roared toward the target once again. Her crew was different now: younger faces, quieter voices. The old engineer had been killed over Magdeburg, the radio operator, wounded in a crash landing. Mallory's hair had gone gray at the temples. His eyes looked older than his years. "Navigator, how far to IP?" he asked. 5 minutes, skipper." He nodded, then looked out the window. Below them stretched the scarred heart of Germany, a land once full of promise, now bleeding from the skies. Flak ahead, 12 o'clock high. Black clouds exploded in front of them, violent and random. The formation tightened instinctively. Mallory steadied the control column, feeling every vibration through his gloves. "Hold it together, boys," he said quietly. Through the nose glass, he could see them, hundreds of other bombers, stretching as far as the eye could see. A flying city of silver and fire, methodical and endless. It was a sight that once filled him with pride. Now, it only felt heavy. The bombardier's voice came over the intercom. "Target identified, oil storage tanks, North Sector. Bomb bay doors open." "Roger that," Mallory replied. "Let's make it count." Bombs away. The grim lady shuddered as her payload fell. Seconds later, fire blossomed across the ground, thick columns of smoke spiraling upward like the arms of some dark god. "Direct hits," came the confirmation. Mallory exhaled slowly. "Let's get out of here." But as the plane banked west, a German flak shell detonated close. Shrapnel tore through the right wing. "Number 3 engines hit," the engineer shouted. "Feather it." Mallory barked. The propeller slowed, then stopped. The bomber dipped. Mallory fought the controls. "Come on, girl, hold together." For a moment, it felt like she wouldn't. But somehow, the grim lady leveled out. "Still flying," said the co-pilot. "Barely." Mallory glanced down at the burning city. "So are they." In the ruins below, civilians emerged from shelters once the thunder faded. Smoke rolled through the streets, carrying the smell of oil and death. A mother knelt beside the body of her son, clutching him to her chest. Her face was streaked with soot and tears. Nearby, an old man muttered to no one, "Where is our Luftwaffe now? Where are the men who said they'd protect us?" No one answered. The once proud German war machine was collapsing. The skies belonged to the Allies now, completely, absolutely. In England, the mood among the bomber crews had shifted. There were no more cheers when missions were announced. No more bravado. Just quiet resignation. They called it the long grind. Mallory sat in the mess hall one night, staring into his coffee. Across the table, a younger pilot, Lieutenant Dempsey, spoke softly. "Skipper, do you ever think about what's down there? Mallory looked up. All the time. I mean, we're supposed to be hitting factories and rail lines, but... He trailed off. Mallory sighed. War doesn't care what's supposed to happen, son. It just keeps happening. Neither man spoke again. Outside, the engines of another departing formation echoed through the night. By March 1945, the end was near. American and British bombers now struck deep into the Reich almost unopposed. The Luftwaffe was a shadow, its fuel nearly gone, its pilots barely trained. The Germans could only watch. In Dresden, the firestorms consumed everything. In Hamburg, nothing remained to burn. People began saying that the sky itself had turned American. April 1945, a final mission. The grim lady was old now, her fuselage patched with new aluminum panels, her name barely legible. She'd flown 30 sorties, a miracle by any measure. Mallory stood beside her before takeoff, running his hand along her side. Just one more, old girl, he whispered. Then we both rest. The target, Regensburg. The mission, destroy what was left of Germany's aircraft production. It was supposed to be simple. It wasn't. Halfway through the run, enemy fighters appeared, desperate, uncoordinated, suicidal. Young men in Me-262 jets and FW-190s, many with barely 20 hours of flight time. They came head-on. The sky turned into chaos. Tracer rounds stitched across the formation. One B-17 erupted in flame, spinning out of control. Another broke in half midair. Jesus Christ, shouted Dempsey. They're coming from everywhere. Mallory gritted his teeth. Stay tight. The grim lady shook violently as a 20mm round ripped through the nose. The bombardier screamed. Mallory's headset filled with static and shouts. Then, a flash. A German fighter slammed into the tail of the bomber behind them, both aircraft exploding in a fireball. The shockwave hit the grim lady, sending her spiraling. Mayday! Mayday! Mallory fought the controls. Alarms blared. Bail out, he ordered. But before the crew could move, the plane leveled suddenly, miraculously. Mallory stared at the instruments. All dead. The altimeter spun wildly. Still, somehow, she flew. He whispered, "Come on, girl, get us home." Hours later, the grim lady landed on 3 engines, her landing gear half-locked, her belly scraping the runway. She came to rest in a cloud of dust and smoke. Mallory stepped out slowly. Behind him, the crew climbed down one by one. The bombardier was gone. No one spoke. Mallory looked at his plane, battered beyond recognition, and saluted her. Then he walked away without looking back. Weeks later, Germany surrendered. The war was over. But for those who had lived under the endless roar of the B-17s, and for those who had flown them, the silence that followed was almost unbearable. In the ruins of Berlin, civilians emerged into a strange peace. No more sirens. No more thunder. Just wind moving through the wreckage. In England, the airfields began to empty. The bombers, those once mighty fortresses, were scrapped or abandoned. Their crews returned home, carrying ghosts no one could see. Years later, an old man visited a museum in Ohio. His name was Thomas Mallory. He stopped before a restored B-17, polished, perfect, gleaming under the lights. On the nose, painted in yellow letters, was a name, the Grim Lady. He reached out and touched the cold metal, his hand trembling. "She made it," whispered a guide beside him. Mallory smiled faintly. "We both did." Then he turned toward the window, where sunlight poured through the glass, bright, silent, and free of war. The B-17s had come every single day, until there was nothing left to destroy. But in their wake, they had proven something far greater than destruction, the unrelenting force of endurance, industry, and belief. For the people who lived through it, the sound of those engines would never fade. Because it was the sound of a world ending, and another beginning.